Welcome, live from New York. Okay, it's not live, but I am so pleased to be in New York. Last year, as you know, the first of you who watched the first Down the Middle with Jeffrey Gundlach was live, filmed in Los Angeles. That was my first post-COVID trip. This is my second. And it's so important to me to be here today with Philip Howard because I'm crossing the boundary from my comfortable spot, from monetary policy, from being the Fed whisperer, to economics and finance, to policy. Because I think we're finally at a crossroads in America where the two must meet in order to make forward progress. So I'm so pleased today to bring to you Philip Howard, Chair of Common Good. Thank you for being with me.
Great to be with you, Danielle.
I'm going to start this off with my favorite writer in the world. She won a Pulitzer in 2017, Peggy Noonan. And this was when the world was realizing that Donald Trump was going to be the nominee for the Republican Party. And she made some observations then that were so powerful because they were so clean. And she wrote, "The protected make public policy. The unprotected live in it. You know that Democrats won't protect you and Republicans won't help you." Your thoughts?
Well, I think Washington has taken a life of its own. It's always been the case, but it's worse the bigger government gets. I mean, there's this enclosed world there where to the Republicans, everything's self-referential about, their kind of theory of the economy and theory of life, but it's not directly connected to the real life problems of, sort of people on the ground. And the Democrats have their theories, which are sort of extremist, and they also don't really seem to think much about what real people need, both economically, but also sort of emotionally, to have ownership of local services and not to have Big Brother tell them how to run their schools, that sort of thing.
Sure.
So you do. I think Peggy's completely right. I mean, you have these two parties that aren't really connected to the real people that they're supposed to be governing.
But if I remember from growing up in a very conservative household, it wasn't always this way. I mean, when I was growing up, at least, the Democrats were the party for the people. That was kind of what, at least it was how they represented themselves. But it seems like today, both parties are representatives in some way for corporate America.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, Washington is a mighty engine of the status quo. So there are, over 5,000 big interest groups in Washington. 5,000? Yeah, 5,000. And these interest groups, all sorts of obscure things. They're the big ones like AARP for senior citizens, whatever. And they're all mainly devoted to the status quo. And some of them some of them are democratic leaning, like the public unions. Mm-hmm. They're there for preserving the entitlements and the lack of accountability and lots of other destructive things, in my view, for public employees. And some of them are supporting the conservatives and the Republicans, big business groups. But none of them are really focused on what policy should be. Mm-hmm. They're really, they're agents. You know how when you're talking to a lawyer, I'm a lawyer, I confess, but when you're talking to a lawyer, he's representing his client. So he's thinking, what does my client want? He's not thinking about what the right thing to do is. All these interest groups are not thinking about what the right thing to do is. The people at ARP are not thinking about the grandchildren of the elderly and who's going to pay the bill when we overspend and give benefits, when the average age has gone from whatever it was in the 1930s when Social Security was created to, 10 years longer.
Right.
they're not worried about the grandchildren. They're worried just about keeping what the grandparents have. And it's kind of a phony model where these agents aren't looking at the common good. And the effect is the parties aren't looking at the common good either.
You know, I saw an interesting chart recently, and it showed the evolution of the age of senators going back 50 years. And it was just a colorful chart showing that as time has gone by, the age of the average senator has gone just absolutely through the roof in the past 2-3 decades.
Right. Well, you have this, but that's a function, I think, to a great extent of the extension of lifespans, modern medicine and such, and the fact that once you get into office, particularly for senators, you tend to stay in office. And it's like the rest of Washington. It's all about the status quo. Once you're there, you're there. And everybody's sitting there defending the status quo and doing pretty well doing it. They're in this endless kind of tug of war, right, where nobody really moves too much. And they make money and support their families, and there's no real risk involved.
Yeah.
And so you have this, it's almost like the beltway around Washington is like a gear, it's like disconnected from the rest of the country. So this Washington spins round and round, and the rest of the country is doing whatever it does, but not really connected to Washington.
So I look at one of my greatest inspirations will always be Abraham Lincoln. Of the people, by the people, for the people. And in thinking about today's talk with you, I was pondering kind of the American dream and being able to be born into whatever circumstances you're born into and still live the dream. And I said to myself, there's 3 major ceilings that exist today that didn't exist when so many successful people today who are at the ends of their career can look back and say, I was born into nothing and I became this icon. And if you look at working parents, especially working mothers, and their inability to step out of the workforce to have a child and step right back in because childcare is so prohibitively expensive. And if you combine that with unions and the fact that we could educate our children at a younger age and get rid of this working mothers leaving the workforce and coming back in, and then you layer onto that higher education.
Right.
And higher education, which has become its own ceiling. So there's 3 different things that would hold back somebody born into a lower station, if you will, on a lower income rung that didn't exist before. And it seems like there are such simple answers to address these so that you could reopen that ladder.
Right. It's interesting. The role of women in the economy is, has to be one of the most important things, along with maybe the IT revolution, in the last century. Sure. Because particularly last half century, and because of all the reasons you state, because of childcare complications, because of the need to work to keep the family going. The husband can't make enough money in many jobs to make ends meet, so you need 2 working parents, and there hasn't been that much thought about what the policies should be. And I think you're right. I think there is a need for schooling, sort of rethinking of schooling, both the age at which people go to school. I mean, we could talk about the underclass at some point. School ought to start at birth, for the underclass.
I'm in complete agreement. That's how you keep a dynamic workforce.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
never fall out of the workforce. They never fall into the safety net.
Right. And in the case of the underclass, the kids need to have a chance. And there's been so many generations now of single mothers that by the time the kids get to be 3 or 4, it's too late. They haven't heard enough words. And so everyone I know,
I just got goosebumps. Yes.
Yeah, in that world, thinks that we need to have a kind of dramatic and massive intervention, social intervention into the lives of these infants, that help them and their mothers grow into the society. And then for larger society, as you point out, we need to have a different but comparable intervention to permit women to actually participate in the workforce.
I mean, these are just such critical, and the idea of, I mean, what my twins were born as Bear Stearns was melting, and I never even left, but the workforce during that time. I remember I was briefing Richard Fisher from the intensive care unit because the financial system was melting down. Right. But I had the privilege. I had the ability to have help with me. I was always able to work from home because I was always connected. And what we're seeing in a post-COVID world is it's not only that so many children in America are disadvantaged because they don't live in that one zip code. But once we became virtual learning, the inequality divide just exploded open.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And we need to rethink the role of education, the timing of education. We need to rethink summer vacation. We used to have summer vacation because the kids needed to work on the farms. That's not true anymore. So why do we have summer vacation? And if you look at some of the most successful schools, they've begun to kind of dislodge those old assumptions to great benefit for the children.
When do you think children should begin inside the public education system?
Well, I think for the underclass, as I said, I think there should be an intervention with children not coming in so much the education system, but in a kind of a parenting help system. Like almost like pods of young mothers with helpers and their infants spending half the day or more together, both with the mothers learning and the children, the infants hearing and learning. And there are really wonderful programs that do that in big cities around the country, but that costs money, obviously. For other kids, I think the sooner the better. I mean, kids they like to be social. We have grandchildren, and they go off to school before the age of 3. And they're off at nursery schools of one sort or another that are very social and very well organized, and the children have the enormous advantage of spending not all day, but in this case, I think it starts out at a few hours a day, and then the next year it gets larger. But there's a reason that the children of parents who can afford to do that. Right. And it seems to work pretty well. So why shouldn't we do that for everybody? And on the other end, this whole idea of higher education needs to be rethought too. I mean, we have these totemic ideas about getting a college degree and stuff. You can do really well in life if you are properly socialized. You know how to work with people. You show up at the right time. You understand what it means to take responsibility and all that kind of stuff. And then you add to that some skills that fit the skills of a mechanic, the skills of a plumber, whatever. Those things are really valuable. You make a lot more money doing that than you would as a PhD. So,
I can attest to that. My HVAC guy, my air conditioning guy, I know he's driving a better, nicer car than I am. I promise.
Yeah, exactly. So we need to do what other countries have done and understand that a college degree, sitting in an office with in the old days wearing a tie, is really not for everybody, and it's not all that a society needs. And we ought to have multiple pathways for people to not only to learn skills and to get into the workforce that way, but also to feel self-respect, for doing that. I mean, doing a good job at anything takes work, and there's pride in being able to fix a car, or fix the HVAC system. And America used to honor those things, and now we have this kind of, kind of vague notion that unless you unless you have a white collar job, you haven't succeeded.
And yet we can't. One of the things that's so frustrating, so many. Just listening to your answer right now, I had unions pop into my head over and over again. And it's not just unions in the public education system, but it's also limitations in terms of apprenticeships that certain unions have. So they put a governor on the number of tradespeople that we can train in this country at a given time, which is just, I don't know where unions belong anymore anywhere in this country, and yet we've just introduced legislation to make unionizing easier again.
Right. Okay, this is really an important issue, because I think this is two discussions. There are the private unions, and before there were private unions, many employers didn't treat employees well, and we didn't have lots of other. Then the regulatory system kind of built up, worker safety laws, that sort of thing, and did much of the job that private unions do. But and the private unionization has declined. It's now 6% of the private workforce, something like that. It's fairly small, maybe half what it was 20, 30 years ago. Although my view is the presence of private unions, or the potential threat of private unions, does keep big employers honest. So, for example, I've studied how the Toyota management system works in their manufacturing plants, for example, in Kentucky. They have a lot of protections. So before they fire somebody, they have these workers' councils that talk about and review the file of the person they're about to fire. And so the company thinks it's in its interest to make sure that all the workers feel that they're going to be fairly treated. And so there's a safeguard. You can't just go supervise, you can't just go fire them. And I'm pretty confident that those safeguards wouldn't exist but for the threat of unions.
Right.
In other words, so I think the presence of unions, private unions, or the potential presence, does kind of keep things, on an even keel for the companies that are not unionized.
Well, we did see Amazon raise prices.
Raise
wages, at the threat of.
Exactly. And so I think there's a role there. Public unions, which is now the largest unionized group, ought to be banned. They are, in almost every respect, and I don't think this is too strong a word, evil. They negotiate against the interest of the public in so many ways. They've basically bought off politicians so that a political leader today makes promises for pensions that come due long after the term is up, so that you have states like Illinois that are actuarially insolvent. You know, there are, I think, something like 20,000 pensioners, public pensioners in Illinois that get over $100,000 in pension. That's $2 billion a year of taxpayers. So you're talking about...
And they're working and living in Florida, by the way.
Yeah.
And they got to retire when they were 55.
Right, exactly. So you have this incredible... So one, it's made certain states effectively bankrupt.
Mm-hmm.
Two, you can't fire anybody. Literally, you can't fire. 2 out of 300,000 teachers on average get terminated in California, which has one of the worst schools.
Say that one more time.
2 out of 300,000 a year can get terminated, you know, through the process of
I guess you have to be
people.
filmed beating a student.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got, there was this great story in New York. There was this teacher who was caught selling cocaine on school property, including to other teachers, who was indicted, convicted, sent to jail, came back, demanded his job back, and in arbitration got his job back.
A drug dealer.
Yeah, a drug dealer. So you have these. So it's literally so there's no accountability, and the harm of no accountability is not that there are all these terrible people like the drug dealer, although there are some. The harm is that when everybody knows that job performance doesn't matter, it makes it almost impossible to manage an energetic institution because everybody knows it doesn't matter. So it's like letting air out of the balloon. So you have these sluggish, horrible departments in schools where the people who try to resuscitate them don't have a chance. And if you find the ones that are successful, and there are many, like Centers for Disease Control is over history been a really good agency, even though it kind of fumbled a little bit with COVID. There are public schools that are fantastic. But if you go to those schools are fantastic because there's a trust that's either instilled by leadership or by their culture that everybody's going to work their ass off to make it work.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a cultural trust. And but in most institutions, if you know it doesn't matter what you do, it's almost impossible to build that trust. And so you have these lousy institutions because everybody knows you won't be accountable if you don't do your job. And that's just a terrible thing. So that's another thing that the public unions do. There's no accountability. And then the last one I'll mention, although I've written a lot about this, is the work rules. The work rules they make feather bedding look efficient. I mean, the 2nd Avenue tunnel for the subway in New York cost $2.5 billion per mile. A similar tunnel in France, using the same kind of machine and everything. France is not known for its efficient work rules.
I was about to say, yes.
You know, a similar tunnel in Paris cost 1/5 as much. So we're talking about multiples of people required by public union contracts. It's just, it literally doubles, triples, quadruples the cost of running the subway system or whatever.
So this is data. This is my world. These are hard facts. These are numbers. I mean, with the system as it stands today, I mean, we can't bring Ross Perot back from the dead. The type of radical reform that you're talking about, which is effectively eradicating unions just so we can get some work done and educate some children, what's the pathway? And that's like my last question. So we're going to have to go backwards in time, but I have to throw it out there.
Yeah. So
that's not really my last question.
Right.
I just jumped ahead.
History shows that change happens in big gulps. It doesn't happen incrementally. Mm-hmm. I mean, things happen incrementally, but not much. The changes that show up in history books happen in time. So the last time we had a big change in this country were the 1960s, where we had the rights. Excuse me. The last time we had a big change was when we had the rights revolution. So we woke up to all these abuses, racial discrimination, pollution, other things, and and we changed the way we organize government. But some of the changes we made didn't work. And the changes included a kind of a micromanagement approach to regulation, including there was no such thing as collective bargaining by public unions before then. They just slipped in during the 1960s. There were no abuses that people were fixing. They just slipped in. And so a lot of the things that make society not work occurred during then. We did need to change our values about pollution and such, but some of the other things we need to change to give back to people, I think, the freedom to take responsibility. The school principal, the teacher, whoever's running the MTA, they need to be able to manage, their public services. So how do you fix this? The public unions are a big problem because they're politically so powerful.
Right.
And because their contracts have long tails, the political system can't really fix it because they have a contract in place, right? So they can't, you can elect somebody new, but somebody new doesn't actually have the authority to run this. So they've effectively kind of corroded, really worse than that. They pulled the rug out from under democracy. We're supposed to be able to elect people to run government, run schools, run the MTA, whatever,
right.
And they don't have the authority because of these public union contracts. So I believe that the way to fix that particular problem is to have collective bargaining declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. And I've written about this. There's a part of the Constitution that's really never been applied in this context, but it's well known, called the Guarantee Clause, that where the federal government guarantees a Republican form of government to all the states. And what that means is, the history shows, that the voters retain the power to elect people to run the government. So a state couldn't be run by an aristocracy or a monarchy. The voters maintain the authority to elect people who have the authority to run the government. That's what a Republican form of government is supposed to provide.
But that's been severed because it's the unions who are effectively in control. That's
correct. And so my belief, and this is my idea, but we're developing it, and we've got leading scholars working with us and such, is that the unions have basically taken away the power of the voter with these contracts. And therefore the solution lies not politically, which is very difficult, but it lies in a constitutional challenge.
So I'm just jumping all around here because you said Constitution. While we're at it, can we address term limits?
It's interesting. Term limits, they put in term limits in the state of California, and it didn't do any good. And what happened was people would get elected, I think they could serve for 2 terms or something, and they immediately started sucking up to whatever the special interest group that would hire them when their terms ended. So it actually didn't do what was intended to do. However, your point about the senators getting older and older and older, we'll have people born in 1930, sort of running the country in 2030, is also correct. So,
I mean, I look at Pat Toomey, and I'm borderline starting a Pat Toomey fan club, just because he had the power towards the end of his term, which he promised would be his last one, to draw a line in Congress and refuse to allow my former employer, the Federal Reserve, to grandfather, keep alive programs that would have effectively allowed for blue state unionized bailouts.
Right.
And he really didn't care about the consequences, the ramifications. He's not kowtowing to anybody. He's leaving in 2022. Right. He knows he's out the door. But it's that type of behavior. You say, okay, how could term limits not help? Because because you can actually get a few adults in the room who are willing to take risks.
Right. I think that's a good point. I think we're at a point now where disruption of the political status quo is just a great need. We can't just keep going the same way. I said Washington's an engine of the status quo. We need to change the people. There actually has been a fair amount of turnover in the House of Representatives, which frankly hasn't done that much good. So we should also, if you want to, talk about the parties, and where the parties have gone wrong and possible ways of keeping the parties honest. But
is there a way of keeping just two?
The way our system works now is the third party always loses, and so you need something like ranked choice voting, where you can get where you can get moderates elected. And today the system, because of the primary system and such, really favors one, extremists, and two, people from one of the two parties. And the person who is might be the compromise candidate in the middle, it would be better, never has a chance. And so ranked choice voting elevates that. So we could change ranked choice voting to ranked choice voting, which a couple of states have done. I think Maine has done.
Maine's your perfect example.
Right. And Maine has wonderful members. I mean, both Senator King and Susan Collins are both very moderate.
I've met thoughtful. Collins. I had my oldest two children read her speech about Kavanaugh and all of the meetings that she had with him on an individual basis, and looking back at all of his rulings and determining for herself. I mean, she actually went and did the work, and I made my children read that speech.
Right. My view is that on the parties, that there are some structural things like ranked choice voting, but I also think we could create what I might call an overlay party. And the overlay party would have principles that could be adopted by people running for either the Republican or Democratic Party. But it would be like operating system principles, like govern for goals, get rid of excess bureaucracy. You've got to make sure people can be accountable. Get rid of sort of public union, lack of accountability. And things that allow people to run a school or to run a hospital system in an effective way. So get rid of this incredible bureaucratization that's occurred over the last 50 years in the name of everything. Central planning. It's mainly what I write about. But no one really disagrees about the need to make schools work better, or to make hospitals work better, to get rid of excessive cost in infrastructure projects, which we can talk about. Nobody disagrees with those things, but it's not part of the ideology of either party. And so what I'm proposing is to create a third layer, I'll call it the common sense layer, where we're going to reboot all of these structures that allow managers to actually manage things, that allow people building infrastructure to do so efficiently, that give permits in a year rather than 10 years, that, and have this overlay, and have candidates from either party subscribe or not to the overlay. And if they do, then they get funding from supporters who say, I'm a Republican and I also agree with this common sense overlay. I'm a Democrat, but I'm going to support this common sense overlay. And so, not unlike the progressive era, when candidates from both parties would actually take on things like, and support things like women's suffrage, for example, this would be an overlay of what I think Americans really want. Let's just make things work again.
Absolutely.
Right.
But it sounds like, if I'm reading in between the lines, it sounds like money is it the key? Is it the core of?
Yes. And so if you create right now the money funnels into both parties, and the funders, almost universally in my experience, are frustrated to death by the fact that the parties nonetheless stick with these, whatever their, whatever ideology they feel that they have to go along with.
Right.
And so what I'm suggesting is, let's funnel the money not into the particular candidates or parties, but into a new practical approach to government, basically reboot these sclerotic legacy bureaucracies so that things can work again, and that people in the community can provide social services in their own way, that schools can be run effectively, that doctors and nurses can spend their time looking at patients instead of spending 2 hours on desk work for every hour with a patient. This kind of absurd stuff that's going on. Do you know, 2 facts. About 30% of the healthcare dollar in America, and we pay almost twice as much as other countries,
right,
goes to administration. That's $1 trillion or $1 million per doctor going to paperwork, basically. Some of that's in the fee for service, and some of it's in sort of overwrought regulatory frameworks like privacy and very overly detailed electronic health records. I was having lunch with the former president of Johns Hopkins, and we were talking about this. He said a doctor had recently called him and he was really frustrated. He couldn't, the electronic health record kept getting bounced by the system. These are really detailed. So finally, this doctor got a real person on the phone about why the system kept bouncing back this patient record, electronic patient record. And the person on the phone said, it keeps bouncing back because you didn't ask the patient if she had ever been a smoker. There was a box you had to check.
A box that was not checked.
Yeah, a box that was not checked about whether you'd ever been a smoker. And the doctor responded and said, well, if you'd looked at the top of the sheet, you would notice that the patient was 2 years old. So you have these crazy bureaucratic systems that are designed for completeness, but literally overwhelm people during the day. I mean, so there's this whole body of cognitive psychology called cognitive overload, cognitive load theory, where some of the leading people in it have joined our Common Good Coalition, because their studies tell them that if you give people too much detail to comply with, you actually freeze our conscious brain, which can only keep 6 or 7 things in mind, so-called working memory, and you end up not being able to access the smart part of the human brain, which is the subconscious, the long-term memory, where solutions to problems or the right diagnosis pops up in a way that's really not logical, but it comes out of your experience and training.
I mean, they tell you when you're young, you can't let your kids sit in front of screens too long. They get sensory overload.
Yeah, yes, exactly.
It zaps their brains.
Right. And so what these experts basically have found is you give people too much bureaucracy to comply with, you make them go brain dead. And so what we've done in this society, in schools and hospitals, really everywhere, is you make people worry about things that are secondary, tertiary, or just filling out the list in ways that make it hard for them to roll up their sleeves and actually solve problems, use their common sense. And I think that's a lot of the source of the alienation, why people are so angry. It's the source of why we had the Tea Party. It's the source of Make America Great Again. People don't really articulate it, and certainly Trump didn't articulate it, but there is this sense that people aren't allowed to be ourselves, and to make things happen. And that's right. But it wasn't done because it's bad to regulate worker safety or to be concerned about patient safety. It's bad because you can't do those things
because you're overwhelmed with trying to get to doing those things.
Yeah, with 1,000-page rule books.
Speaking of 1,000 pages, the tax code.
Right. The tax code, my favorite.
It's not my favorite. Every year my CPA takes a little bit longer and a little bit longer. The more they simplify my taxes, the longer it takes him.
taxes, at best, involve rough justice. There's no, and a tax system is something that periodically simply has to be rebooted. Just like Napoleon created a new civil code, and he appointed 4 judges. It only took him 5 months to actually redo all the codes of France to come up with a proposal, a simplified code.
These inefficient French really know how to get things done.
Well, they actually have a theory of authority. So, and then it wasn't Napoleon just doing it himself. The legislature in France met over each code and debated for over a year, each one, and Napoleon himself presided over half of their proceedings. It was, he said, and it's right, his most lasting accomplishment. And that code is still the basis, or the evolution of it, of civilized law for half the world.
Right.
And periodically, you have to, it's called recodify. You have to redo codes to simplify. So they take a life of their own. The United States tax code is the most obvious example of that. I mean, we need a radically simpler system. There's so many freebies and special benefits built into, I talked about the special interest groups. Boy, there are special interest groups for like every page of the tax code.
And it's something we've spoken about in the past, and it's just, why do a certain number of Americans even have to deal with taxes? I mean, until you hit a certain income bogey, why even? It just seems like
clearly. I mean, it should just be so radically simplified. There should be a general agreement on whatever the slice should be for some income up to a fairly big income, then get slightly more complicated when people have their own business, whatever, unavoidably. But even so, it could be simplified. There's some really smart people who've thought about this over the years. And people disagree about whether we should move towards a consumption tax, for example, and others. But Michael Gratz is somebody who's a tax professor, who's been sort of a radical thinker in this regard. But in general, you said, how do we make change? This country is overdue by probably 2 decades for a recodification aimed not at changing our values, but at making things work practically, which is the American character. And we're not going to get that recodification until we create a new public narrative, which neither party will lead for the special interest groups, a new public narrative aimed at making things work again. A practical, not an ideological, a practical narrative. And so what I'm trying to do with Common Good, and I've been working with people like Mitch Daniels, whom you know, who's now the president of Purdue, and Bill Bradley, and several think tanks, the Progressive Policy Institute, American Enterprise Institute, people at Brookings. We're all trying to come together at this moment to launch a series of public discussions, which I hope you'll be a part of, on the need to reboot the system to make things work.
Gosh.
What a radical idea.
Can I get an amen? I mean, and you're right, though. It seems like 2016 was one of those moments. And yet here we are 4 years later, and Congress is more divided than it's ever been. It seems like reconciliation is going to be used as a weapon of mass destruction.
Right.
And that by the time we get to midterms, which the Republicans are already campaigning for aggressively, they've already stopped legislating. They're finished. They're just looking at 2022.
Right.
And Democrats are just making legislation, just however they want to make it. I speak to my friends inside the Beltway, and They're like, well, if you classify the legislation as being something to relieve COVID, then you can make all kinds of things reconciliation. And I'm like, well, this is just going to tear us further apart. And I don't, so my biggest pet peeve, what I've written about the most, it burns me up, especially as somebody who lives in Texas where hundreds of thousands of oil field workers have been displaced. And now it's a much more efficient economic industry than it once was. Even if they go back to their old production levels, they won't have to bring back the same number of workers. Just like the steel industry back in the 70s and the 80s, when there was massive strikes in Pittsburgh, right, and we first started importing steel, and all of a sudden, what was left of the domestic industry was a very streamlined version of its prior self. But there are tons of workers out there who could easily be picked up and put into positions where they could quickly, I mean, if the state of Texas manages to get its highways built pretty quickly, and they work with private companies, and we've got great roads. So we know that there are ways to get these, and we know that the workers are there and scattered throughout the country. And yet I get this sneaking sensation that we're going to pass $3-4 trillion of infrastructure spending and not do anything.
Right. Well, that's what happened. You know, the $800 billion that was the stimulus, it seemed like a lot of money at the time, back in 2009.
You have to be a former central banker. We only speak in trillions.
Yeah, it was the $800 billion, a lot of that was aimed at infrastructure, remember? I mean, it was supposed to be spent, it's going to be a great investment and such. 5 years later, the Obama administration did a report showing where the money had been spent. It turned out 3.6% had been spent on transportation infrastructure. The reason, because, as Obama said, there's no such thing as a shovel-ready project. And so instead of changing it, which is what FDR did, when he was confronted with bureaucratic roadblocks, he just blew through them. Obama just accepted it. And so I've written a lot about this and studied it. The delays in permitting, because of these kind of endless red tape cycles where you have 3,000 or 4,000 page environmental impact statements overturning every pebble. I did a report on the project to raise the roadway of the Bayonne Bridge in order to allow post-Panamax ships to go into Newark Harbor. And some really brilliant, practical public employee had figured out that you didn't have to build a new bridge, you didn't have to tear down the old bridge, you didn't have to build a tunnel. You could just raise the roadway within the existing 80-year-old arch, and it was going to save 75% of the cost and have no environmental impact because it's using the same foundation.
Right.
It took them 5 years and a 20,000-page environmental assessment to get approval to do a project that had no environmental impact, including required studies of all the historic buildings within a 2-mile radius, even though the project was not affecting any buildings at all. I mean, it was just like this law has kind of, we're all choking on this law. And something similar is going to happen with this infrastructure plan unless they change the rules. Now, in the 2016 election, both Hillary and Trump cited my report, which is called 2 Years, Not 10 Years,
right?
On this. And then when Trump got elected, he tried and did make some of the changes that I had suggested.
But I remember the public-private partner. There was a lot of talk about it.
Yeah, exactly. But the problem is ultimately the solution to that and the solution to many of the problems in the regulatory state is that you've got to give people the authority to use their common sense. So an official, like the head of the Council of Environmental Quality, has to have the authority to say, oh, you're just raising the roadway of the bridge on existing foundations. Give me 50 pages on construction impacts. No one has that authority.
I need one traffic study.
Yeah, exactly. And so that doesn't mean they can do whatever they want. They still have to comply with the general goal set forth in statutes of studying important environmental impacts. But that case requires a judgment that, well, there's really no important environmental impact, so just do a little review on how it's going to affect the neighbors, and that's it. But no one has that authority. And we need to change the laws to give people the authority to use their common sense. And again, neither party, we talk about the parties not doing it and using reconciliation and all these different ways. Neither party has the idea of simplifying these structures so that people can use their common sense again. That's why we have to create an outside force, not unlike the Tea Party, but it's not tear down government. It's actually make it work, and let's have a way of holding officials accountable when it doesn't. That's sort of the formula for life, right? And it ought to be the formula for government as well.
When you were describing Napoleon and his being at the helm and getting things done and periodically doing reviews, China kept coming into mind. Right now, China has 30 airports, 30, that are under some stage of construction and or modernization.
Right.
They've got high-speed railways. I hate to say that China's the example, but every 5 years or so, they come together, they reassess, and they say, are we sticking to our long-term goals? If not, let's change the rules and move on.
Right. So you don't have to be a totalitarian state to make things work. America used to make things work. They built the Erie Canal. All sorts. They built the interstate highway system. The interstate highway bill, 1956, was 29 pages long.
Wow.
10 years later, they built 21,000 miles of road. Today, the last transportation bill was close to 1,000 pages, and it would take 10 years just to go through the review process. So something has happened in America that's fundamentally dysfunctional that neither party is talking about. And that something is that no one is given the margin of authority needed to take responsibility, to build a road, to hire the contractors, and to be accountable for it. We've tried to create this self-enclosed bureaucratic system where all people do is follow rules all day long. And, well, let's say the truism. Nothing in the history of mankind ever got accomplished because someone followed a rule. That's just not how, that rules are there to prevent bad things from happening. I'm not against, all rules. But if you want something to happen, you want to have a classroom be successful. That requires the energy and willpower and love and skill of the teacher. You want to run an effective infrastructure building program. That requires a contractor who's working hard and under pressure and to
produce, has a bottom line.
Produce at the price, and all of that. And we have lost that idea. And so that's why I think we need to build a new political movement that's not ideological, but it's about empowering humans both to do and to judge each other about how we're doing.
So when you think about kind of the near term and the fact that a good portion of the country feels like its voice was never heard, and this whole idea of a middle ground, and we're in a world of social media.
Right.
I mean, how do I help to get the word out to multiple generations that this is how simple it could be?
Right.
I mean, how do you communicate the message in real time in the world we live in when it's so much easier to spread disinformation?
Right. Well, we're doing this. We're having this conversation, so that's important. I think we do need to make what I'm talking about into a thing. We need to have the slogan and have that be, we have 7 governing principles at commongood.org. The first one is govern for goals. The last one is the seventh, restore the moral basis of public choices. We need to argue about things. It's right and wrong. It is wrong to spend $2.5 billion for a mile of subway in New York when it could cost 1/5 that. That's wrong. That's $2 billion out of taxpayers' pockets. It's $2 billion that could be spent educating underprivileged. I mean, every public dollar involves a moral choice. And if we're wasting if we know that we're wasting dollars, we're acting immorally, and we have to argue it on that basis. You can't argue it as just, oh, that's inefficient. The same with climate change. I'm concerned about climate change, so let's deal with it. But don't argue about it as, can you prove that Houston's going to be flooded in 20 years? No, I can't prove that. But let's argue about it as a fellow stewardship. We have obligations, moral obligations as stewards, to act responsibly for future generations. Just as our parents built the interstate highway system for us or whatever, we need to build a system that works, for our children and grandchildren. And we don't have that. We're not arguing these things in moral terms anymore. We're arguing them in ideological terms with social media. There's this whole narrative about how the last election proved that Americans are all divided and stuff. I don't buy that. They're divided by social media. They're divided by all these abstractions, but they're not really divided about what they want. There was this book written a couple of years ago by James Fallows and Deborah Fallows called Our Towns. And Jim, I know a little bit, is a private pilot. He has a little single engine plane. So they flew around the country for a couple of years and would spend weeks in different towns and stuff and describe what was going on in those towns and how people felt and what they were doing civically. And one of the towns they visited was Dodge City, Kansas. And I think it's Kansas. And Dodge City, famous Dodge City, voted 76% for Trump. They're completely conservative. They had recently passed an $85 million bond for a local school of which 85% of the students were children of migrant workers and immigrants. They had done all these projects not for, not to help the white people who had been there for years,
right,
who were all voting for Trump, but to help the people who were not like them. And the point of the story is that, and there are lots of studies that back this up, is that most people want to be good. They want to do what's right. They want to do what's needed. And in Dodge City, an incredibly conservative town, what was needed was to help the underprivileged. So these people opened their pocketbooks to do that. And so I just don't buy the narrative that people are divided. They don't have. If you give people back a measure of authority to provide social services their own way, they'll take ownership. Things will work better. They'll start helping those underprivileged children. If you make it all be bureaucratic rules coming from on high, and you make it hard for the church or synagogue to provide programs in their basement because there's a little religion attached to it. If all the rules get in the way, then you drive people out. But if you do, my father was a preacher.
I'm getting that.
Yeah. If you let people have the chance to help other people in their community, they will. And it will not only be good for the people who need help, it'll be really good for the people who are doing the helping.
I mean, when you talk about community, there was this massive snowstorm that hit Texas. And it awakened a sense of community.
Right.
That, I mean, I had my mother, my best friend's mother, my best friend, her 2 kids, her dog. I mean, it was a little cozy in there. But I was one of thousands of people.
Right.
I mean, we looked around us. There was genuine tragedy. There were people in 39-degree homes, and this was bureaucracy gone bad. This is something that could have been prevented. And yet, what came out of this was people having, it's kind of like what's come out of COVID. I mean, a sense of family has emerged from COVID in a lot of parts of the country.
Right.
Because, you're either going to knock off one of your children or get used to having them all under the same roof again. And eventually, you're riding around your neighborhood on Sunday afternoon, and you're one of many families of 5 and 6 people riding around their neighborhoods on Sunday afternoon, getting fresh air. And so COVID gave us family, but tragedy seemed to give Texas community.
Right.
And it just seems like that's so missing in the fabric.
Yeah, I think re-empowering community, I've been, it would just be so good for American culture. There's so many things that need to happen on a community level, starting with helping underprivileged children,
and their mothers.
And I have a friend years ago he was a very successful Wall Street executive, and we were having lunch 35 years ago, and we're talking about economic things. He said, ultimately, an economy is what you value. And I never really thought about that. And so, for example, if a society values creating big stone heads, then you'll have an island culture where all they did was create big stone heads until they went, until they went extinct, basically, because big stone heads weren't that, didn't put food on people's tables. So what do we value as a society? Well, we're past the point, happily in this country, mainly of food, but there's still a lot of people on the edge, and so we need to deal with that. But going back to the beginning of the discussion, make it easier for women to work and, and other things. But we can also value things that we haven't put priorities on, including caring for children, especially caring for underprivileged children, local cultural activities, the band in the gazebo, they used to have 100 years ago or whatever. And a sense of kind of local pride and of helping each other in community. And
there used to be the town green.
Exactly. And so you read Jim and Debbie Fallow's book and you get a sense that instinct still exists, but the systems aren't designed to make it easy for people to do that. And so, in a world where you had much simpler regulatory codes, where you had oversight not for specific compliance, whether you have a material safety data sheet for the Joy dishwashing liquid in your business, or all these kind of idiocies of modern bureaucracy, or check the box whether you were ask the patient whether they were a smoker or not. Right. The smoker's 2 years old.
The 2-year-old.
All these idiocies, where you have a sense that regulatory goals are about protecting outer boundaries, and you let people within those boundaries do things in their own way. So it's a simpler goal-oriented regulatory
autonomy
framework.
Within some simple guardrails.
Yes, exactly. And so if you created a framework like that re-empowers people to do things in their own way, oh my God, it would just be, communities can learn from each other. It would just be wonderful for our self-respect. And I think the alienation that has driven a lot of the kind of political craziness and extremism would disappear. It would just vaporize, because people would wake up in the morning knowing they can make a difference in their own community.
We need to bring back community banks. That's a thought that came to mind, by the way, because that's what helps communities grow. I learned a few weeks ago, conducting another interview, that the majority of Germany's exporters are very small businesses that have a very robust network of small, not-for-profit community banks that make sure that they take care of their given radius and make sure that their economies flourish. And I said, well, what a radical idea.
Well, banking, you're a banking expert. Traditional banking was based on reputation. And, and it wasn't hardline data, stuff. I mean, you looked at whether the company had a chance to succeed or not, but the community banker, knew the people involved and had a sense of whether they would, make it go or not. I mean, I started a firm, in the early 80s, so a long time ago, and I needed to borrow close to $1 million to build out the office and all that kind of stuff. And I went to a banker I knew, and I didn't have, they gave us the loan because they thought that I was a serious, substantial person and that I would figure out a way to make it succeed.
Well, they said he's good for the money. And that was, and they knew it though, because they were part of the community that you were part of.
Right.
So we're coming up on the 100-year anniversary of Gennaro DiMartino landing at Ellis Island.
A great, great historic event.
Absolutely. I mean, he went on to live the American dream. I mean, he was in the service in the 40s. He was 2 years old when he came, a non-smoker. But he came over and ended up working and being trained as a mechanic in Great Britain during World War II. He came back to East Haven, where he had settled, and he ended up with 2 DiMartino Sinocos on either side of I-95.
Wow.
And I'm a third-generation gearhead as a result, but he was the American dream. And I feel like that American dream has somehow been lost on us. Where does immigration belong?
Yeah, it's interesting. Immigrants are doing incredibly well. It's Americans that aren't doing so well. You look at communities, not just the Silicon Valley or places where you have these obvious geniuses come in and they, create Google or they run Microsoft, or whatever. But you look at many communities and you find that the people who become the civic leaders are immigrants. There's one of the stories in the Fallows book is a town called Columbus, Mississippi, where one of the leading protagonists is Indian. He's an Indian extraction. I mean, it's in Columbus, Mississippi. I mean, this is, how does this compute? And it's Eastern Europeans in upstate New York. There were lots of success stories of immigrants. And why is that? Well, it's the same as was this your grandfather?
Mm-hmm.
It's the same as your grandfather. People come in and they say, I'm allowed to do what I can do. And so they don't let themselves be held back by the rules or the prejudice or anything else.
Right.
They go and do, and they do what it takes. And instead we have a narrative design. This entitlement narrative just drives me nuts. I mean, people say, well, I'm being held back. Well, yes, and every immigrant has been held back, and there is, and we certainly want to minimize or get rid of, if we could, discrimination and such. But people succeed and immigrants succeed in spite of that. And they succeed the way all people succeed, which is by pleasing the people around them. They make a product or provide a service that works.
Mm-hmm.
And notwithstanding the fact that maybe some people are against them, they continue to do the work that people need or want. And guess what? That generally leads to success.
I mean, we're in the room with Sam, who's not on camera right now, but Sam came over from Columbia to attend high school in the United States alone because he knew that where he was, there were barriers.
Right.
And success story in the making. I was in the back of I was on my way to an airport recently, stuck in traffic, and I got into a chat with the guy, the Lyft driver taking me to the airport. And it was around the time of the election, and he said, "What are you people fighting with each other for?" I can't remember what country he came from. He said, "I came from this country, and the opportunities that I have here,
Right.
There's just nothing to complain about. I'm on my way to success, and you're killing each other."
Right, right. It's
and they
almost,
have this vision of our country that's better than our vision of our country.
Yeah, completely. And so there's a sense of modern America that's like a, sort of like a rich family with too much money that's quarreling over the money instead of appreciating, what they have. Again, that's a reason why, I think if we could create a new narrative of human empowerment and responsibility and accountability, the old narrative, and begin to have proposals about how to make it work. Okay, how can we start building infrastructure in a year? This is about the permitting part. How do we avoid waste in feather bedding and infrastructure? These are the laws we need to get rid of. How do we engage local community energy to help the underprivileged? Here's how we need to here's the framework we need that allows people to actually take ownership, rather than having Big Brother tell them how to provide the services. If we start coming up with these proposals, it's actually not that hard to do. It's actually easy to create simple laws that are implemented by humans taking responsibility. That's easy. Creating those laws. I could do it. Just like Napoleon appointed 4 judges. The main guy was named Portalis to do it. I would love the job. Give me 3 other people, and we'll just blow through every area. We'll create simplified codes, and we can do it within a year. And those codes, they won't change any public goals. We're not for unsafe workplaces or whatever.
Right.
People do it. We'd give people back. Would be goal-oriented, principles-oriented. Would give people back the freedom to do things in their own way. And you would see a surge of energy, not just rebuilding infrastructure and stuff that would happen, but of local energy that would be in history books, because people are frustrated to death by this system, and so they get lost in this kind of narrative, this polarized narrative.
So I'm going to wrap up with a question that you might or might not be able to answer. And you're a self-identified lawyer, so you can't take that back.
Yeah, I can't take it back, no.
We are a nation of checks and balances that sometimes uses checks and balances as a shield. Is there a role that the judiciary can play? My gallows humor was that you're finally going to get the Illinois judiciary to work when some judge doesn't get the ambulance to show up on time because he keeps voting the pensions rights in one generation. Is there a role that the Supreme Court can play such that the people could have a voice in designing a new system? Or is that just too far-fetched?
No, it's not too far-fetched. I mean, the ultimate power actually does come with the people. Tocqueville said there's amazing power in the point of view of people. So ultimately, the name of the game here is for you and I to create a new narrative, get a lot of Americans to sign on to it, turn it into a political action committee, support candidates from either parties, that this new human empowerment narrative. So that's the ultimate goal. But yes, the Supreme Court could do some amazing things. They could declare, for the reasons stated, public union collective bargaining unconstitutional. They could, this is really important, they could direct the trial courts to dismiss any claims that would undermine the freedoms of people not in the courtroom. So if somebody brings a lawsuit because their kid fell off a seesaw and hurt their head, you can't let that claim go to a jury, whatever the jury does. Juries are generally sensible, because what will happen is people will be at risk for seesaws. So all those seesaws will get ripped out. And that's what's happened, basically, in America. There are no seesaws left. What the judge ought to say is, I want to hear expert testimony of whether seesaws are, for kids of a certain age, a reasonable risk because it teaches them how to cooperate and all that kind of stuff. And it's fun. It gets them outdoors and exercise. And if it is a reasonable risk, then I'm going to make a ruling as a matter of law about whether the claim should be allowed. Because if I allow the lawsuit to go to the jury, all the seesaws will be ripped out because no one's going to want to pay the risk. So we need to understand that what people can sue for establishes the boundaries of everyone else's freedom. And that's an idea that's been lost in our society. It hasn't been lost in the UK, which is also a common law country, which has had a bunch of rulings exactly on that point. I've met with and talked with and did forums with the law lords on this in England. And the Supreme Court, if it did that and it got rid of the public unions, that would enormously liberate, both those things would enormously liberate people. And
back to my favorite pet peeve, the term limit. I mean, that is an avenue that could be
absolutely.
pursued.
Term limits, ranked choice voting, there are structural changes that would be really good, particularly maybe term limits, in the Senate. And then you could revisit it again in 20 or 30 years. I mean, my view about electoral rules is that they always need to change in order for not to have some game slip in. You need to constantly kind of disrupt.
I think we just learned that in this last election.
Right. So all those things are good.
One last one. I lied. I have one last one. What did COVID teach us about government in America?
It taught us that when you have immediate needs, like the need to trace people coming over a year ago, you can't require the public health officials to get approval first from Washington. It took them a month to start acting. I mean, it was really sinful. There was one public health researcher in Seattle who sent in an emergency application to start trying to trace people, and it got bounced because he hadn't submitted it in hard copy. He'd only submitted it on email. I mean, what is the mindset of these people? I mean, so it taught us that. It taught that if you unleash the power of private initiative, like with creating the vaccines, amazing things can happen.
I mean, this was a global phenomenon.
Right.
These were thousands and thousands and thousands of scientists just with open lines of communication.
Right. And it also taught that if you want to vaccinate a population, you need to have a business leader, maybe like somebody who ran factories in World War II or something. You need to have someone who actually knows how to organize action. And the states were just floundering all over the place. It's just been, as we know, where they've gradually gotten their act together, but months later than it should have. So there were places where, like with the creation of the vaccine, and which occurred, but with the distribution, which did not occur, where we really need to put people in charge. Give people responsibility of doing it. And every time the bureaucracy got involved, whether it was with stopping the COVID initially, or creating the first tests, or doing the vaccine. Whenever the bureaucracy gets involved in dictating how to do things, it fails. It goes back to the thing. Good things don't happen because people will follow rules. Good things happen because somebody rolls up their sleeves and make it happen. And so COVID has taught that, it's given us that lesson on several levels.
Well, from the bottom of my heart, I hope that you can continue to spread the common good with this latest example that's going to be very fresh in people's minds for a long time.
Well, it's great to be with you. And I think there's a great opportunity here. The American people are dying to be, to be able to take responsibility again. Let's create a framework to let it happen.
You've got my voice. I'm all on board. I'm looking forward.
Great. Again, great to be with you.
Same here. Thank you. I hope that you are as electrified as I am. I'm telling you, I had to get on an airplane to come and do this in person. This was not a Zoom moment for me. If you enjoyed what I have to say, if you want to get behind the movement, if you want to find your voice as a moderate American, join me. Go to commongood.org and study more. Reach out to me individually. I'll send you everything I've ever written on infrastructure. It's going to happen one person at a time. And in the event that you're new to Down the Middle, I invite you to go to the last time I got on an airplane for my very first interview with Jeffrey Gundlach, and then watch every episode since, because it is my aim, financial literacy, bringing about more common good. That's what we're all about. And if you haven't subscribed, please do so. And I look forward to the next time I get to visit with you at Down the Middle. Thank you.